Hey, this is Grover Norquist, President of Americans for Tax Reform with the Leave Us Alone podcast. What we're talking about is the coalition of Americans who simply want one thing from the government, and that is that on their vote-moving issue, they wish to be left alone. And one of those groups is taxpayers. And yesterday, Wednesday, there was, how about Wednesday, Thursday, there was a very good Ways and Means Committee. This is the tax committee. They did a good questioning of the head of the IRS and got him to make a lot of confessions it's a good start towards perhaps beginning the long slog to reform the IRS. I want to encourage everyone to subscribe to this podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts and or Spotify, and leave a 5-star review. That helps get more people to join us here. And if you're watching the live stream right now, please be sure to hit the thumbs up on YouTube and subscribe to the Americans for Tax Reform YouTube channel, or like us on Facebook. What did we learn when the Republicans and the Democrats at the Ways and Means Committee hearing started to ask some questions of the IRS? Well, among other things, we found that the IRS plans to hire 1,200 armed IRS agents. Why does an IRS agent need a gun? They send you a letter and tell you how much money you owe. They call you on the phone. They talk to you that way. What is the purpose of being armed? They're talking about getting 350 plus hired each of the next 3 years, 1,200 total. Why are they doing this? They're hiring in sites, all 50 states they're hiring. And in the ads that they've run, they say you have to be ready to use deadly force. You have to be ready to kill people now to go work for the IRS as one of these gun-carrying IRS agents. What's that about? Is this new for the IRS? Well, yes and no. The IRS admitted when they were investigated by TIGTA, which is the agency that investigates other agencies, that there were, in fact, 4,600 guns in the IRS, 4,600 guns, more than there were people with the right to carry a gun. So several guns per. And there were 5 million rounds of ammunition. What 5 million people were they planning on shooting at? What are they doing with 5 million rounds of ammunition or 4,600 plus guns? Well, so they've been having these guns. What did they do with them? Well, again, TIGTA report, looking in, what did they find? Half the time the IRS-owned guns are fired, more than half. It's a mistake. It's an error. They don't know what they're pointing at. They didn't mean to shoot the gun, okay? This is the first thing they teach you in range safety. Don't point the gun at anything unless you're willing to destroy it. And the IRS, half the time, doesn't even get that. Be an interesting question. What about the ones that you count as good shots, okay? So the IRS was asked, okay, so what happened when you fired the gun when you had no business firing the gun? Well, some things were destroyed and there was some personal injury, but they won't tell us where. I'm looking at a thing here, which is the redacted response from the IRS, basically saying, we won't tell you what happened when we shot by mistake. It would be embarrassing. You know what? Government doesn't get to tell the American people. It's a secret. It's embarrassing how badly we behaved or how stupidly we behaved. Go away, shut up. By the way, we have guns. But that's the IRS's answer when asked, when you just shot for no reason or by mistake, who got hurt? What happened? Somebody died? We don't know. Not from your report. How much damage? What do you mean damage was done? How much damage was done? And we now find that the people who took those shots and there was no effort to train people better with handguns. Now you might ask yourself, why would anybody in the IRS need it? If you really need the police to go talk to somebody, send the police. Don't send some IRS agents. But they want to have the guns themselves and have the ability to go in. In the 90s, this got to be such a problem. Okay, these are not new problems. The IRS is asking for more armed people ready to kill in 50 states with 5 million rounds of ammunition, plus whatever else they're getting for their $80 billion. You can buy a lot of ammunition for $80 billion. When in point of fact, they haven't come up with training practices that make any sense. Their guys don't know how to use their guns. Their storage habits are ridiculous and not at all what we need. And yet they want more guns. And there were hearings back in the late 90s. What did they find out? Well, people came forward that the IRS had broken into their homes, businessmen and women, threatened their children, waved guns around at 5 in the morning when everybody's sleepy, because, or they went in and ransacked their offices and took all the computers. Why? With guns, pointing guns at the people who work there. Why? Well, turns out disgruntled former employees called and made up stories. And the IRS, on the basis of that, decided to send guns in to people's homes. You could drop by and ask to look at the computers. You might have talked to the so-called whistleblowers and said, give us some specifics. But instead, they went in with guns. This is not an agency that is shown it should be trusted with guns, that it has any respect for people, or that's even smart enough to figure out that maybe ex-girlfriends or boyfriends or disgruntled employees might pull this stunt. And it happened more than once, and they haven't fixed anything. And when asked about this stuff, I mean, this is part of the problem of giving $80 billion to an unreformed and unrepentant agency. Okay? These are the guys who, during the 3 years, during a 3-year period under Obama, the very political head of the IRS back then, Lois Lerner, set up a special little police operation, illegal police operation, where they took if a conservative wanted to incorporate a not-for-profit, like a foundation or a think tank or something, during 3 years, no conservative was allowed to get permission to have a not-for-profit. Many left of center groups. The conservative groups were all sent to someplace in Ohio, and they died there. One in 3 years got approved. Later, the IRS apologized for that. The IRS settled with some of the people that they'd misused. But Werfel, the new head of the IRS, when he was being questioned Thursday, referred to it as the alleged political abuse. Alleged. No, there were hearings that they went through this. They got caught. They apologized. They acknowledged what they did in legal documents. But the head of the IRS goes, oh yeah, who knows what really happened? That is someone who doesn't know his history, doesn't know the way the IRS is, or he does, okay, he knows perfectly well what was going on. He's just lying to the congressman, thinking he can get away without admitting what they did. And I think you ought to say to them, you know what? And the Republicans, in their most recent budget proposal, the negotiation with President Biden on the debt ceiling increase, they say we're going to repeal that $80 billion. You have proved you've learned nothing from shooting in the places you shouldn't be shooting at, having guns you're not trained for, going after people in the middle of the night because some ex-girlfriend or boyfriend or staffer, called it in, and you endanger people's lives for nothing. And then you, for political purposes, discriminate against people based on their politics, and you deny them their right to organize, to petition their government. This is like in the Constitution. The IRS should read it from time to time. This is a very real problem, and this was all exposed for people to see. Now, many of these things come from studies of the IRS from the Inspector General looking at the IRS. These are government documents. Everything I just gave you is all government numbers and documents and admissions of what they did. Now, some of them are not very well thought out admissions. Yeah, we shot things, put things in places we shouldn't have. What were they? We won't tell you. It's not exactly coming clean with the American people. And yet they want, and every single Democrat in the House and Senate, and President Biden says, let's give these people who shoot when they shouldn't, who break into people's houses when they shouldn't, who politicize their shop and go after conservatives, taxpayer groups that want to organize to keep taxes low, and say to them, you cannot participate in the American process or it'll be against the law because you don't have a permit. you don't have a tax deductible incorporation papers. 3 years. 3 years of that level of shutting it down. And by the way, you run into the Tea Party recently? No. All of those groups were smothered by the IRS's attacks and refusal to let them incorporate as regular groups, as all other groups, left of center groups do. That was an incredible, that was the IRS stepping in the middle of what became a game-changing election. In 2012, the Democrats lost the House and most of the Senate because they hadn't crushed the Tea Party. 2 years later, they'd crushed it, and Biden got himself elected with the IRS and its political muscle making that possible. And there has been no reform, and there will be no reform. They've just been given more money. Until we take that taxpayer money back and say, you don't get money until you show us you've learned from breaking into people's homes in the middle of the night on bad information, because you don't know what you're doing, when your guns are going off and you won't tell anybody who got hurt and how much got hurt when you didn't mean to pull the trigger, or so you say. This can't go on any longer. The IRS has a union, and the IRS union gives money to politics. And it will not surprise you that 98% of the money they send from their dues, from their members, goes to Democrats. We have a one-party IRS, one-party government agency that has a history of attacking conservatives and Republicans, the Tea Party movement, of denying them their rights to petition their government by incorporating and setting up little think tanks or activist groups, as everybody else does throughout history, and as liberals were allowed to do during the Obama years, while the IRS was sitting on top of a anti-tax limited government campaign and destroyed it with the power of the IRS. This nonsense has to stop. And I have to say, Jason Smith, the head of the Ways and Means, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, is doing a very strong job in bringing out these facts. Now, this stuff has almost all been written out in the past, even in government documents. But you didn't see it on PBS, the government paid for TV station, which doesn't like people to mention it's government TV paid for, or taxpayer paid for, most of it. But of course, they never attack the IRS or the government when it's growing, because they're part of growing government. So, and the establishment press doesn't spend enough time investigating government if it would embarrass the government that they tend to highlight and hold up and want to give more power. But as more Americans see these congressional hearings, they're on C-SPAN, not filtered by any network. You can see this information. It really will begin to change minds. And we can go to where we say to the IRS, if you may need more staffers to answer the phones, because you're not answering the 20% of people who call in get their phones answered. They should probably get the half of the 53% of IRS agents who work from home to come into the office and pick up the phone. That would be a good start. If you then needed more, show us you've reformed, and then we could talk about whether there's any of the budget needs to be increased and what of the budget needs to be decreased. So to sum up, the IRS, to recap, to have some final thoughts, the IRS has been running amok, or rather under the direction of both Biden and Obama and Clinton. There were abuses under Clinton. I served on the commission set up in response to what happened during the Clinton years, the abuse of the IRS. They were auditing many of the conservative groups, not the liberal groups, back then. This is what the Democrats have done each time they get control, and it doesn't happen the other way around, because the guys inside the IRS are already decided they're supportive of the modern Democratic Party. We shouldn't have politicized civil servant workers, but that is what you have at the IRS. That's what their political giving shows, and it's a huge problem. Thank you to the Republican congressmen and senators, Jason Smith in Ways and Means, and the others, Comer, who've begun to do some investigative journalism. Someday we'll have journalists that do investigative journalism, but right now we have some congressmen doing some investigations of the IRS, and I hope we learn enough and the American people see enough that we can take this $80 billion they want to spend without reform and reform themselves and their practices of political persecution and selecting people to be attacked by the IRS, end that. And then when we have a clean IRS, a non-political IRS, maybe they need more money here or there, then you can have hearings about that. But we know now what they do with their money, and buying guns and threatening people is not acceptable. Thank you very much. Grover Norquist.